now. All right, so we're recording. So please raise your hands if you have questions. We'll bring you up on stage. This is Patrick Masson. Patrick was the director of the Open Source Initiative out of San Jose, although he had a heck of a commute. I think you were in Albany for all the time I've known you. And he's nice enough to come up here and talk to us about open source licenses. We owe him an apology because the whole use of Zoom has kind of opened some holes in our open source cred right now, but we will work on it. Again, please, if you have any questions, he's a very good extemporaneous speaker on all the other times I've seen him talk. So, please feel free to test my endorsement. Patrick, do you want to?
Yep, I'll start off. You can hear me, everything, right? Everything good, hopefully. So I apologize to the students. The way this is set up, I can't see myself or the Nooks interface. I only see my presentation. So although you can see me, I'm flying in the blind. So I'll need an audio cue if the room catches on fire. As Wes, first, thanks for inviting me. I've come out a few times, even back when Morthy was teaching the course, so it's been years. And I'm usually asked to talk a bit about open source licenses, intellectual property, and how the open source definition and the OSI enable open source development, promote communities, and foster adoption of open source software. So just quickly about me, as Wes said, I was the director and general manager of the Open Source Initiative, which is a nonprofit organization we'll talk about more. Before that, my career was in education, CTO for the University of Massachusetts system, chief information officer, CIO at the SUNY offices, and before that, I was out in California at UCLA, where I worked there. And in all those roles, intellectual property, IT management, contract procurement, around software was critical. I've been a active user and contributor to open source projects since the mid 90s when I was in school and before it was called open source, when it was just free software. So hopefully I'll be able to give you a little bit of information that you'll find useful as you begin your own work with open source, and not only open source, but software in general as you go along. So what I thought we'd cover is, what is open source software? That might seem like an obvious topic or an obvious answer that most of you already know, but I'm always surprised sort of the gaps in understanding what the open source initiative is, talk a bit about licenses and intellectual property, and then how the success of open source, I'll give some examples of open source licenses and how the success of open source software has sort of opened up a new set of issues. I often say that the greatest threat to the success of open source is the success of open source. So there's some sort of post-open source activity now that working with the OSI, we've sort of identified and are working to address. Many of you have probably seen this analogy before, the idea of open source software being a recipe. So in this case, it's chocolate chip cookies, and with open source software, or open source, in this case, it wouldn't be software, but any sort of open resource, the licenses allow for the original work to be used for any purpose, modified, redistributed, either in modified or unmodified form, and used by anyone for any purpose. So the example using the cookies is the original developer might have been grandma, and she makes the best chocolate chip cookies in the world, and she always gave them to the grandkids, and that's pretty much the life of her recipe. And she was happy to share it with the family and share it at the bake sale and with the church group or whoever might be interested. Grandma's the company, finds that same cookie recipe, loves it, thinks it's awesome because it's been opened, licensed with an open license. They take it, they make the exact same cookies, they package them up and sell them. And again, because it's openly licensed, that recipe, the evil person can take those cookies, they can use them exactly as they are, they can change them, modify any way they want, and they can use them for any purpose. So in this case, the bake sale for evil. So that open license allows anyone to use the, any use, anyone, any purpose, change it, keep it original. You're allowing people to freely use your original work. And the open source communities agree. These are just some of those that work with the OSI and understand the open source definition, which we'll talk about more. And these are companies as well. These are just samplings, folks that I thought you would recognize, especially these ones here. I tried to keep them either education or sort of obvious open source projects that you would recognize, that understand and accept the right to use, modify, and redistribute our key fundamentals to open licenses and open source software. Those same groups, here's some quotes from them. Again, Google Open Source, GitHub, Department of Defense, so on. They all, in their explanations of what open source and open source software is, it's free distribution, allows derived works, software can be used for any purpose. Anybody is free to use, study, modify, redistribute the software, allow distribution, allow modifications, and so on. And then those same organizations also recognize the authority of the open source definition and the OSI as steward of that definition, and as the community recognized authority for certifying licenses as guaranteeing those permissions to use, modify, and redistribute. So there's consistency and continuity across industries, open source projects, internationally. The open source definition and the OSI is recognized. But the open source initiative and the open source definition just didn't spring out of the ether. It did just pop up one day. There's actually a history that led to the open source initiative and the open source definition. And that started with the sort of Unix and Unix-like companies that were really developing Unix-like, and so on, and software and hardware related to that. When software was first created, it wasn't really even sold. It was included with the hardware sale. The real sale, the money, the market was around selling hardware, mainframes and to large organizations. Computing was a highly centralized, only large organizations and governments departments did it, and the software was seen as a way to further the sale of the hardware, which was where the money was. What good was these big machines that sat in rooms unless they did anything? So the support and the service and the software was all included. Until about 1964, when IBM had the 360 series of sort of mainframes, was the first to be unbundled from the software. You could install different software on it. You didn't need IBM's expertise to come in and engineers. You could install new software, extend the software, and it was the first sort of mark where software began to become its own resource. It was a value recognized as valuable beyond just the hardware that it ran on. Then in 1965, Charles Bachman, he said he was the first person to break away from the sneaker net. The sneaker net was, you pick up your stored media, whether that was your source code or your data or whatever it might be, and you'd walk it across the room to another computer, and you'd install the tapes on that machine. And so there was no network where you could send data, where you could connect machines, where you could share your project or your code or anything like that. Everything was stored on physical media, and it was transferred from machine to machine. Bachman and his group, while working around database issues, his quote is the first person to send software via network. So you can see, as these innovations occur, as these developments occur, it's creating an environment where open source can take place, right? So we're beginning to see software decoupled from hardware. We're beginning to see access to machinery and networks that allow for collaboration. Then you have the hobbyist movement, where where computers were being developed. Again, it was the hardware. The homebrew computer club was about building machines. And the software, again, was, well, we just need to have something that's standard that we can get to work on all these machines so that we can use the hardware. And that was the key. And in fact, there was, as people began to share our software to run on different, customized, locally developed, single one-off hardware configurations and developments that people were making on their own, that software was being shared between groups. And there's a famous, if anyone's seen it, this open letter to hobbyists from Bill Gates before Microsoft was Microsoft. And they had created basically Altair Basic that was being distributed between friends, shared amongst people in the clubs. And he was irked because they had spent all this time to develop this software. And again, because it was just shared on probably DAT tapes or cassette tapes, or who knows what it was shared by the medium it was shared on. It was just being passed around, just like, old cassette tapes where you could record friends, or today it might be digital songs, or, whatever it might be. So there was this idea that it's unfair that people are stealing the intellectual property, his and his friends' work. And he put this letter out charging people of theft. So it sort of set the mindset for Microsoft's initial business model of scarcity and licensing of software. Then once the hobbyists sort of made headway and the companies began to see the interest of personal computing, they began developing their own personal computers. In 1980, IBM was primarily mainframe computing. In 81, they launched the first PC, but they didn't think it was really worth anything. There's maybe a few people use it, just hobbyists again. And there wasn't any operating systems or software for it because it was just going to be a niche group that ever used the personal computer. Around the same time, in the 80s, some folks might know the story of the printer, the Xerox printer at MIT, where they got a new printer donated from Xerox, and what used to be software that was editable by the department was now locked down, and modifications couldn't be made. Richard Stallman's group had created a little utility that would send out an email to folks if the printer had jammed, and they wanted to do the same thing on the new printer, but that couldn't happen because the software was closed and just the binaries, they couldn't fix it. So that sort of sparked this idea of software freedom, and the idea that anyone should be able to access the software, because as Richard Stallman once said, if you don't control your software controls you. And at the same time, Stallman and his group were working on a project called GNU, which is GNU's not Unix, and it was going to be a Unix derivative or variant that was licensed in a way through something that Richards calls copyleft, and it's a play on the word copyright. And the idea is that the copyleft version allows anyone to use it and modify it and redistribute it. And so the four freedoms, the essential four freedoms, were created in order to describe free software. And they're the freedom to run the program as you wish, the freedom to study how the program works so you can change it, and then obviously you need the source code access to do that. The freedom to redistribute copies, either the native copy or the derivative that you might have created, modifications you might have included, and that those ideals created the general public license. So GNU as an organization created the GPL, and the Free Software Foundation as an organization that develops free software was created. And that again is in the late 80s that all that sort of came through. In 91, Linus Torvalds sent out an email talking about creation of a new Minix variant, again, a Unix derivative or flavor. And it wasn't going to be a big deal. It was just, asking everybody, sort of the hobbyists out there. And he wanted to make it free. If you read the email, all these quotes are from it, and like GNU, and just for personal computers, and it won't be big. But interestingly, here again, we see sort of the culmination of several of the previous historical things. They sent this via email, so it was taking advantage of the network effect, the ability to get in touch with lots of people and over the internet where they all could contribute and communicate. It was everybody was invited. You didn't have to be a engineer with a title at some company. It could be a hobbyist, a tinkerer. It could be an engineer at a company. It didn't matter. The Unix flavors and the Unixes that were out there, were seen as a operating system that might be applicable to the PC industry, where IBM wasn't paying attention and there weren't standard yet really PCs. I mean, by 91 there was obviously Windows and so on, but they weren't really that more sophisticated than the Unix variants. They want to make it free, again recognizing the freedoms and the GPL, and today Linux is still distributed under the GPL. So all of these attributes to create Linux only existed because of that previous work. Eric Raymond wrote a paper called "The Cathedral and the Bar." It's "The Cathedral and the Bazaar." It started off as a paper and then it became a book, and it's got some sort of seek to understand the development model that allowed Linux to be created and thrive. And so there's various little nuggets in there that all point to the ideals and the values of open source. Although at this time the label hadn't been created yet for open source software. But the thing that Raymond says is that the cleverest hack and most consequential hack of Linux wasn't really the technology, but the invention of the Linux development model. So the idea of mass collaboration, and that's where you get things like many eyeballs make all bugs shallow, or given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, and the best programmers, know what to rewrite and reuse rather than coming up with their own stuff. So all these sort of ideals come together through the Linux community, and it's first sort of captured and articulated within the Cathedral and the Bazaar. Netscape, which I don't know how many people know what Netscape was, but was in the browser wars with Internet Explorer and others that were out there that aren't no longer there. But Microsoft was embedding Internet Explorer with their operating system, with Windows. So when you got Windows, Internet Explorer was already there. And Sun Microsystems, Scott McNealy had said, the future of, looking at the future of technology, the computer is the network, and the browser is going to be the thing that delivers computing technology to people. It's all going to be through the browser. So there's a real interest in creating, getting market share with browsers. And in fact, it became a lawsuit, went to the Supreme Court, Microsoft's business practices of including Internet Explorer and creating a monopoly around browsers. So in Netscape, which was just, really just was actually the first browser and the first started off sort of the access to the web for the everyday person, didn't have that additional resources of shipping along with an operating system that everyone was using. You had to go and download it. So they thought, how could they become more appealing? They read, folks at Netscape read the Cathedral and the Bazaar, and they thought, hey, what if we make this a tool that everyone can collaborate around? And maybe it'll be the same disruptor that Linux is to Microsoft Windows. We can make Netscape Communicator the disruptor for Internet Explorer. So the first open source, again, it wasn't even called open source at the time, but the first what would be recognized as an open source license and pass the criteria, the open source definition, was the Netscape public license. It's now called the Mozilla public license. And you can see there in the source code of, or in the license, specifically in section 2.1 are the rights to use, reproduce, modify, display, perform, distribute with or without modifications. That's all in that license. And so that could arguably be the first software distributed with an open source license, but it wasn't the first free software. Obviously, Linux was around, and the GCC compiler, and there are other, Unix or Linux utilities and things like that were out there. But that's sort of generally recognized as a key event in the adoption or the the emergence of open source software. Bruce Perens, who's the author of the open source definition, several other folks, Brian Bellendorf of the Apache Foundation, Linus Torvalds, forget everyone. They had a meeting at with the Netscape folks in Palo Alto. And they had a strategy session trying to figure out, okay, how can we use Netscape's release of Communicator with an open license? How can we leverage this to raise awareness and create community and sort of start off this movement? And the free software movement had been going along, but there were some other, maybe not technical, social philosophies that also sort of go hand in hand with the free software movement. And the word free itself was confusing. You didn't want to walk into a company that made a lot of money from its software sales and say, hey, you should have all free software, because people thought free as in no cost, not free as in liberty or freedom. So that strategy session got together, and pictured there is Christine Peterson, who came up with the term open source software. And from that meeting, in 1998, the open source initiative was founded, and one of its goals was to certify licenses as meeting the criteria set forth through the four freedoms, and the GPL license was obviously foremost in that, and now the new Netscape license. And so they needed to have some criteria set up to be able to evaluate licenses. They want to create a set of licenses that any company could take and apply to their software and ensure that they enjoyed the benefits of software freedom, but I just noticed there's a 1997 in the middle there. I have no idea why that's there until I distract me. Oh, it should be in the upper right. So the Debian project, which is a Linux distribution, had something called the Debian Free Software Guidelines. And they use these guidelines to assess whether or not they should include software, package that software with their distribution of Debian. So when the next version came out, it would include, new utilities, tools, any software. Does it meet this criteria? And they did that in 1997 as part of the Debian project. And Bruce Perens, who wrote the Debian Free Software Guidelines, then took that and made it the open source definition. So this became and is used today, the criteria when a license is submitted for review to see if it can be called an open source license, and thus the software distributed with it is open source as well. This is the criteria that's used to assess that license. Does it guarantee all of these things? And there's more of them. There's 10. I couldn't just fit them on the screen, but you'll see that they're the exact same. The Debian Free Software Guidelines originally had 9. A 10th one was added, I think, in the early 2000s, but essentially they're the same, and they're recognized as again, the open source definition is recognized as the tool internationally and by all those projects and by those companies. The certification process through the OSI, and the steward of the open source. So it's a pretty standard recognized process now. And that's what the OSI does. It really works to protect and promote open source software. It stewards the open source definition, and it helps to create community around open source projects by enabling the ideals and the ethos of openness and collaboration and things that are aligned with the open source software movement. So the board is made up of practitioners. They're elected by the community. I've highlighted there some of the companies the current board has worked for. So again, these folks come from open source projects, free and open source software projects. They come from industry. So that's the OSI. Here's some of the popular licenses. The Apache license, again, the GNU licenses, the MIT license. Those are the ones that are through a variety of research come out usually as the top ones associated or used by projects. Again, I'd emphasize that only software distributed with an OSI approved license should be labeled open source software. And we'll get into why that's important, why that label matters, and how people rely on it, and the expectations around when you say something's open source, and the expectations around what the license allows and the permissions that are included. And the license process, review process is actually quite complex. It's not, again, just the OSI who comes up, the 11 board members who decides. There's a pretty intense, which I'll show in a minute, license review process. There are 260 members of the license review process. There's over 500 members of license discuss, which is sort of like the license review process. It sort of helps people tune their license before they submit it, or if they have questions about licenses, whether they should even submit one or not. It sort of goes through that discussion, then it goes through the license review. And the license review project or process works, as I mentioned, first to ensure that the license conforms with the open source definition. It also looks at whether or not there are previous licenses that are similar. What's so unique about this one that there needs to be a whole new license approved. It discourages vanity or duplicate licenses. As open source has become popular, people want to have the Microsoft open source license, or the Mozilla public license, or the Eclipse. Right? There's a name associated with it, so that can be used as sort of marketing promotional to show that your company's name is included if you're really trying to push your company's alignment with open source. So here is I just grabbed some of the most active discussions around different licenses. So you can see that there'll be 100 discussions on the open innovation license, or discussions around why the unlicensed shouldn't be allowed. The server-side public license had 233 discussions. These are all public. You can join the conversation. Anyone can participate. You can go to the open source initiative and sign up for the mailing list, and you will see all the chatter coming across on different licenses. If there's something that you're particularly interested in, or an expert around, or just want to follow along, you don't have to chime in with any insights on whether or not the license qualifies. But the point here is that there's an in-depth discussion going on around each license to ensure that there's consistency, so that industry, government, projects all can have confidence that no matter what the license subtle variants might be, they all allow for the use, modification, redistribution of that software for anyone, by anyone, and to do anything. So the OSI also works with sort of the protection role. We worked with GitHub to come up with the Choose Your License tool. We worked with Stack Exchange on defining licenses for all of you folks that just copy and paste suggestions out of your favorite Stack Exchange forum. We do educational initiatives. We work with the government. In the U.S. government, we've worked with the Obama administration on coming up with a source code policy that requires 20% of publicly funded software projects to be distributed under an open source license. We provided an amicus brief for the Google versus Oracle Supreme Court case that was maybe 6 months ago or so, net neutrality and the FCC. In New York State, working with there's a law out there now that if you put so many hours into an open source project, you can take it as a tax credit. We worked with code.gov and code.mil, the IRS, on understanding open source projects and foundations, open source voting systems in California. Internationally, the EU on licensing issues related to 5G networks and patents. There's flags of all the countries we've worked with, Italy, procurement process for Indian IT departments, all sorts of things. So that's the OSI and the open source definition. Any questions there? I'm going to switch back real quick. I don't see any hands raised, and Wes isn't yelling at me. I assume I'm still talking to somebody.